life insurers put life into the things you live for. The new factory that's hiring your neighbors. Maintenance on the bridge that keeps traffic flowing. The paycheck that puts pizza night on the table. Life insurers contribute $8 trillion to communities and local economies through bond purchases and other investments, and protect the financial security of 90 million American families, like yours. See how life insurers put life into America at acli.com. Paid for by the American Council of Life Insurers.
The More Money Show with Steve Moore. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
My next guest is one of the top monetary economists in the country, if not the world. She should be on the Federal Reserve Board, she might be the next Federal Reserve chairman because she is so knowledgeable about how do you create a sound monetary system. Of course, I'm talking about the great Judy Shelton. Judy, thanks for joining.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be with you.
So you've written so much on this subject. Oh, by the way, is this your latest book, Good as Gold? Is that the latest one? You've written so many books on. Is that the latest?
That's the latest one. Thanks.
Good as Gold. I love that title. That's a great title. I want to make, and you want to make the dollar as good as gold.
Well, I certainly want the dollar to be an honest measure. I think it's meant to serve as a unit of account for the people who are actually operating in the real economy. It's not supposed to be just one more government tool to try to manipulate economic outcomes. So I think we want a dependable dollar that is a store of value you can count on.
Yes. Well said. And that's so simple. And yet I think those 400 economists over at the Federal Reserve Board don't really get that. And that's a big part of the problem. Now, Judy, one of the many reasons I wanted to get you on the show, and thanks, I know how busy you are on a Saturday afternoon, but I wanted to ask why it is that when the inflation rate was higher 4 or 5, 6 months ago, and the Fed lowered interest rates, before the election, and now inflation is lower than it was then, but the Fed announced they're not going to lower interest rates. That looks very blatantly political to me, Judy. It looks like that Chairman Powell was trying to give a little bit of a lift to the Democrats, Kamala Harris before the election, and now there's no love lost between Donald Trump and Jerome Powell, and Powell refused this week to cut rates. And by the way, I could argue either way about whether the rates should be cut, but it doesn't make any sense why they would cut rates 6 months ago, but they won't cut them now.
It doesn't make sense. And here's the problem. The Fed refuses to abide by any kind of monetary rule.
Yes.
So they should at least have a consistent narrative.
Yes.
But they do not. And last September, suddenly they reduced, concerned about the labor market. It was almost immediately apparent that was an ill-placed concern. Mm-hmm. And then they lowered at half that rate, another 2 times, I think, to try to diminish the speculation that the September move had been political. And the new narrative was going to be, we will steadily reduce the interest rate because inflation is steadily coming down. And they stuck with that right up until President Trump was inaugurated. And then they changed the story.
Well, I sure hope they do. And by the way, Judy Shelton and I were both nominated by Donald Trump to be on the Federal Reserve Board. She knows way, way more about Federal Reserve policy than I do, so you were 10 times more qualified than I was. But it is interesting that one of the reasons that senators voted against you is because you basically are for a strong currency and a currency that holds its value. And I guess the politicians don't want that.
Well, inflation mostly serves to the benefit of debtors.
Government.
And there's no bigger debtor than the government.
Good point.
And I don't consider myself a hawk or a dove. I've always said I'm a woodpecker because I just keep hammering away at this idea that the dollar needs to be a dependable measure. Yeah. I think this opens up the deeper question of what is the appropriate role of a central bank in a free market economy. And I think what we're seeing is that, my first book, since you mentioned books, was predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the reason that country went bankrupt is because the Soviet banking system was a way to channel the savings of the people straight to the government, not to the real economy, not to come up with any productive output that would increase prosperity for real people. It was just to finance a government deficit, which kept growing. And that's the danger that we have when the Fed overly controls the interest rate instead of trying to be just responsive to the market forces of supply and demand for loanable capital.
So when you are on the short list, there are about 4 or 5 people who are being considered to be the next Fed chairman, and there's no secret that you're one of those people on that list, and it's a good list of people who I think are very strong. What if you do become Fed chairman, and I think you'd be fantastic, what are some of the first things that you would do?
The first thing I would do is to question even the concept of deliberately imposing restrictive interest rates. That's all.
What does that mean?
The Federal Reserve acknowledges, ever since it's been at this, what it calls openly a restrictive rate, is that they're kind of phobic about economic activity.
Right.
So they're very leery of growth, and they believe that economic growth is inherently inflationary.
It's ridiculous.
And they don't even like it when the unemployment rate gets too low. And so they deliberately, in order to quell inflation according to their model, try to curtail economic growth in order to reduce demand.
Well, Judy, we only have 90 seconds left, but it's such an important point you're making, which is, and under Reagan, we had growth rates of 5% and 6%, and we had inflation going down. So I don't even understand how they can say when the economy is producing more goods and services, why they think that would mean higher prices.
Right, because this ties in with the whole supply side concept.
Yes.
Where the best way to fight inflation is not to reduce demand, it's to increase supply. So actually, if interest rates were lower, you would have much more access to capital for small and medium-sized businesses who would hire the people who would increase output. And it's that higher level of supply relative to demand that brings inflation down.
Oh, my gosh, Judy, you're just making too much sense. That's the problem. But you know what? I mean, look, to be serious about this, one of the reasons that there's political resistance, what you're talking about, which is so sensible, is it takes power away from people at the Fed and the politicians and puts more power in the hands of the American people.
Well, right. And you asked what I would do. One thing is I have been critical because the Fed has become too powerful, too prominent, and that means too political. And they need to reduce rates and shrink the balance sheet, not have such a huge footprint in financial markets.
Well, Judy, you are Judy Shelton. Her book is good as gold. You're the person to do that, in my opinion. So I'm rooting for you.
The More Money Show with Steve Moore on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Life insurers put life into the things you live for. The new factory that's hiring your neighbors. Maintenance on the bridge that keeps traffic flowing. The paycheck that puts pizza night on the table. Life insurers contribute $8 trillion to communities and local economies through bond purchases and other investments, and protect the financial security of 90 million American families, like yours. See how life insurers put life into America at acli.com. Paid for by the American Council of Life Insurers.